It's Thursday evening and about 7 o'clock. And so that means it's time for Andy and I to have another encouraging word. And I do hope that it'll be encouraging to you. Andy, you doing okay?
Doing great. Yep, doing fine.
We're welcome everyone to our study today. Andy, did you get any snow the other day?
Dusting. Yeah.
We got more than a dusting. We were completely white for a few hours. So for those of you who live in warmer climates, a cooler climate has come our way. We have been noticing that for the past few years, we've been getting a little bit of snow in October. So that's not terribly unusual, but it's telling us that something even colder is coming. Let me just quickly read a text that we're going to use as one of our main verses today, and that's found in Hebrews chapter 11. Some of you will find it pretty familiar. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 23 through 26. It says, by faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. There are actually several words in here that could be our encouraging word for tonight, but the word that we've decided to study for a few minutes with you is the word reward.
Yeah, that's definitely an encouraging word. Before specifically considering the reward Moses looked to from the text that you just read to us, maybe we ought to remind ourselves about the larger context that brings us to that text. The author of Hebrews is appealing to Jewish Christians and to remain faithful to Christ despite the challenges that they have faced, because he wants them to remain faithful to Christ because the superiority of what Christ has to offer over anything that the law of Moses offered. But it appears, for one reason or another, that people were being tempted to let go of Jesus, perhaps due to social pressures. And so they're reminded of how they previously endured suffering. If you go back to chapter 10, and I'll just jump right into the middle of verse 34, knowing that you have a better and an enduring possession for yourselves in heaven, therefore do not cast away your confidence, which has great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that after you have done the will of God, you may receive the promise. For yet a little while, and he who is coming will come and will not tarry. Now the just shall live by faith, but if anyone draws back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who draw back to perdition, but of those who believe to the saving of the soul. So I think it's important for us to see that this reward, in this context, we're told, is a promise of a better and an enduring possession. It is, as he goes on to say, justification and life that is obtained by faith. The saving of the soul is the way that he refers to it here. And so then, as you get into chapter 11, the famous examples listed there of people of faith are there because they acted in faith and could thereby see that which the faithless could not see. And this faith was tested through various trials, which often required sacrifices in their lives in anticipation of something better promised by God. And so if you jump over to chapter 11 and notice verse 6, we all know this text pretty well. But without faith, it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. So the faith that is notable to God, that God values, is the faith which not only believes that God exists, but also believes that God rewards those who diligently seek him. And thus, the examples that he's already cited, for example, Abel offered sacrifice, Enoch pleased, Noah prepared, Abraham goes on to say obeyed and sojourned and waited and sacrificed. And in short, these trusted God's promises and thereby acted in faith, looking forward to the promises.
Yeah, those of you who have been listening to our studies over time, we've talked on several occasions. Several of our words have been deeply rooted in the fact that that faith and hope look to the future, and that they require faithfulness, continued hoping. They require an eye that sees what other people cannot see. Andy, I thought what you wrote, in fact, I wrote it down. In fact, if I can read my writing, that the faithful see what the faithless cannot see. I really like that a lot. I'm probably going to say it more than once here. But because in talking about Moses, and he looked to the reward, it's an illustration of what you just read in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 6 as the people who God is looking for, the kind of people who diligently seek him. What does diligent seeking look like? You've mentioned several people who are pleasing and obeying and going. And in Moses's case, we find some interesting things here. And primarily, we're going to be talking today about some aspects of sacrifice, some aspects that in his life where he had to actually turn his back on some things, and that faith sees that is worth it, that the reward is worth sacrifice, giving up some things. By faith, he refuses to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chooses to suffer. We'll talk about that here a little bit more in just a minute. But what he sees, what he esteems, what is going on in his thinking, I mean, why would a person turn his back on the riches and the treasures of Egypt? You know, what would cause someone to do that? And I'll tell you that sometimes there are people today who are quite rich, that are very comfortable in their lives. They have their needs being met, and they sometimes don't seem too interested in a greater reward than that. Seeing that there is more to life or life after life. And Moses did see that. And so he winds up not simply seeing what the rest of us see, you know, the pleasures of sin and the riches and the treasures in Egypt. We see that. But he saw something that the faithless do not see. And that is what is called here the reward that would ultimately come from Christ.
Yeah, and I think to appreciate these sacrifices, it would be good to glance back at Moses' situation, which obviously in the text we've read in Hebrews 11 gives us the pertinent details. But recall that he was a Hebrew baby, essentially adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, under circumstances in which, even as Hebrews 11 makes reference to, his parents had to hide him, which they did by faith, because of the order of Pharaoh for the baby boys, the Hebrew baby boys, to be killed. We can imagine why an exception was made here. Pharaoh's daughter finds this child. We're just not given the details as to why she was touched by this situation or desired to have a son, but that's what happened. She adopts him as her own. And of course, we're familiar with the fact, not just from the Bible, but even from ancient history, secular ancient history, that Egypt was among the most advanced and powerful civilizations of that time, whereas the Israelites were not. They were their slaves. They really weren't even a real nation yet. So through no effort of his own, Moses found himself transported from powerless poverty into palatial prosperity. Yes, I wrote that down. I like alliteration. So from powerless poverty to palatial prosperity. Again, that was not of his doing. He's a baby. He's an infant. And really, you go back to the Exodus account, I should say, and there's really no details there. You just told that it happened, and we're not told what that would have been like to be such a child, raised in that kind of environment, but we can imagine. And actually, the New Testament informs us, not only here in this Hebrews passage are we given some insights, but if you just flip over to Acts chapter 7, in the midst of Stephen's defense, Stephen's sermon, he makes this observation. It says, and Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. But when he became 40 years old, he saw the plight of his people. So Stephen observes that Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. Well, that's a lot of wisdom. And we're also told that he was mighty. There's no elaboration. Again, we're kind of left to our imaginations as to what that might mean, pardon the pun, but he is he in a position of power? You might imagine that if he's a grandson of the Pharaoh. Has he been in the military? We really don't know, but he's mighty in words and deeds. So his spoken word and the actions that he takes. And of course, Hollywood and others have jumped into this gap that we have in exactly what happens here and filled it in for us. And in some cases, they may be right. But think about it. For the first 40 years of his life, he had the privileges that come to the rich and powerful in this life. And we know what that's like in our day and age. Yet all of those treasured advantages that many of us who are in the middle and lower classes might only dream of having access to, all of those treasured advantages and pleasures, the Hebrews writer tells us, were viewed as passing, temporary, when compared to the reward that God offers. And that's an impressive faith.
It's hard to see it that way when you're immersed in it.
Sure.
And evidently, as you said before, evidently Moses was able to see what the faithless don't see, that those things are passing, that they're not permanent, and that there is something in Christ, that in the coming of what Christ was going to bring, in his part, Moses's part that he played in making that plan come about, was something that was a reward worth going from, I wrote it down, palatial prosperity to pastoral places.
Palatial.
Huh?
Palatial palaces. Or something like that. I've already forgotten. Go ahead.
Palatial. That's what I thought. That's what I said. Palatial prosperity.
That's right.
He went from palaces to pastures, and by turning his back on the palace, turning his back on Pharaoh and the riches of Egypt, which were at his were at his, perhaps thinking even that he could eventually aspire to leading Egypt itself, and then turning out. Must have been somewhat confusing what God was working with him to send him out to be a a shepherd for 40 years. And yet we see from the book of Hebrews, we see that he esteemed it greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. He didn't just look at the loss. He knew that there was God was working something more. And let me just say, add a side note here, and that is that maybe this can help all of us who live in this rich nation open our eyes when we are called on to risk, sacrifice, give up, lose some things. It could be jobs, it could be material things, could be our lives at times, and maybe us thinking, maybe God is asking too much. Maybe there's something wrong here, and this isn't how God acts. And we come to find out, Moses tells us, yes, God does work in this way, and we need to maintain our faith, because it is, we sometimes think, no, it's a financial issue, or it's a suffering issue. It's a faith issue. That's why this story is being told in this chapter in Hebrews. And faith, he tells us, the key here of strengthening faith, even maintaining faith, being motivated by faith, the key is we're helped when we look to the reward. As long as we're saying it's not worth it, as long as we doubt the reward, we're going to hesitate. We're going to postpone. We're not going to do it.
I think it's also important for us to see, and thus I'm going to reiterate some things already said, that this faith was not effortless or otherwise passive. Moses refused. That's an action. He refused. He chose to suffer affliction with the people of God. He esteemed reproach for a greater cause. And he, as you just said, David, looked to the reward. And we emphasize that when we were looking at Abel and Enoch and Noah and Abraham. There are action words throughout Hebrews chapter 11. Faith prompts that kind of behavior, prompts action. And this reminded me, when I was thinking about that, there is more character development here in what the faith that God values than we realize sometimes, I think. Jesus, you might recall, pronounced blessings on those who, in contrast to the ways of the world, focus on and embrace spiritual qualities, things that God values. We're familiar with the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. Jesus says, just think about this as I read this in connection with what we've been talking about. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. You see reward? Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And notice this. Then he starts to make application to his crowd. Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for your reward in heaven is great. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So the willingness to sacrifice and suffer, be persecuted for the cause of Jesus Christ and his righteousness, while at the same time clothing ourselves with all of these countercultural characteristics that he lists in what we call the Beatitudes is the kind of faith that God blesses and rewards. And this is all active and necessary to be the kind of faith that God counts as righteousness. You might recognize that terminology as well. Abraham's faith was counted as righteousness. This takes effort on the part of every believer. And the reward that God offers is according to our deeds, our attitudes, our words, our actions, and our endurance. So I think those are important things to fully develop this faith that we're talking about that looks to the reward. I think we need to emphasize these aspects as well.
I think we sometimes look at people and kind of scratch our heads and go, "Oh, how is it possible for them to do some of these incredible things? The Abels and the Enochs and the Abrahams and the Abrahams and the Isaacs and the Jacobs and the Sarahs, and how did they do it?" And we look at them as though maybe in some way they just, I don't know, had superpowers or something, or just got lucky somehow or other. But like you said, no, they participated. They played their faith into the game. It's not really, maybe not a good way of saying it, but like Abraham, like Moses, he did esteem. He made choices. He refused. He looked. He participated. Looked at the reward, and so that winds up being all of it. It's interesting to me that the verse you read with Jesus talking in Matthew chapter 5, kind of takes a dark turn at the end there with suffering and persecution. And we see it here, right back here in Hebrews chapter 11. He esteemed the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt. It's fascinating to me that he doesn't say that he esteemed the treasures of heaven are greater than the treasures of Egypt. He could have said that. He could have said that, and it probably would be valid and inviting. A street of gold, and we're gonna. We didn't. I bet Egypt didn't have that. But look at what he says here. He doesn't say that the treasures of heaven are greater than treasures of Egypt, although that's true. What he actually says is that the reproach of Christ is greater riches than the treasures of Egypt.
Right.
Very fascinating. What he's saying here is that I'm willing to do anything. And what's interesting is that when you're reproached, when you suffer for it, it shows how valuable it is to you. And so I have an opportunity. This suffering is an opportunity for me to show how valuable it is to me. If you're going to suffer for something, you go, nah, it's not worth it. Well, then that shows its value. But what he's saying here is that when he suffered reproach for Christ here, not just when he got a better reward, but suffering reproach was greater blessing, actually a greater reward than the reproach, than all of the treasures of Egypt. And it's kind of interesting how that shame sometimes can be a detriment to faith and sacrifice. It sometimes does keep us from doing the right thing because we're embarrassed or we'll lose something or what people think about us. But he says here, the reproach of Christ, I'm just telling you, if you look at it the right way, Moses is saying it's worth more than all the glorious gold of Egypt. And next time you see that National Geographic magazine, or that special on TV, or the museum display with, all the Tutankhamun gold and all that kind of stuff, think, whoa, wait a minute. Moses turned his back on all of that. And Moses considered the suffering that he had to go through when he had to flee and all that stuff that he went through was worth more than all of this and more. It's kind of interesting to us that when we can actually see what those without faith don't see, when National Geographic shows us something, it's eye-opening. Wow, that's cool. And Moses's faith is even greater.
Yeah, what's impressive about Moses and these other examples of faith to me, when I think about it, is that they were seeing things much more dimly than we do.
Yeah.
In living long before the fulfillment of God's promises to the patriarchs and God's eternal plan in Christ, these did not know exactly where they were going or what they were undertaking, but they believed and they acted on that faith. They didn't have the perspective of the resurrection like we do now, that we're on this side of the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. We have far more evidence, and thus we're without excuse for not enduring the trials and the tribulations and the sacrifices of this life for the reward. I'm also a little bit concerned, this touches on something you mentioned earlier, that the heavenly reward that many people imagine for themselves is thought deserved, and oftentimes is more materialistic and selfish than it should be. Sometimes we take literally the images of gold and crowns and mansions and have these as our motivation, the carrot out in front of us, when in fact, we need to think less about the imagery and focus on their meaning, the beauty of the victory that we can have through faith in Christ and the prospect of dwelling with God forever. We've been studying recently here in Pontiac in our adult Bible class, the book of Job. And I am impressed that despite Satan's accusation that Job only feared God because he was blessed, Job, through his endurance of the deprivation of God's blessing, still ultimately trusted in God. And what we have to ask ourselves is, would we? Do we? Real quickly, James chapter 5, verse 7. Therefore, be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting patiently for it until it receives the early and latter rain. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brethren, lest you be condemned. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. My brethren, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord as an example of suffering and patience. Moses would have been one of those. Indeed, we count them blessed who endure. You've heard of the perseverance of Job and seen the end intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. We see the end intended by the Lord, but Job didn't see the end intended by the Lord, yet he remained faithful. So in the end, God is very compassionate and merciful, and none of us deserves that. But isn't that really the reward we want? The reward actually made possible by Jesus Christ, whatever it is in specific details, is worth more than anything that this temporal world has to offer. And that encourages us to press on in faith.
Yeah, that's powerful, Andy. You know, all the people in Hebrews chapter 11 didn't see the end during their lives. In fact, didn't even see the spiritual end until after Christ came. And yet they are, according to Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1, this great cloud of witnesses that surround us. And because of them, he says in Hebrews 12 and verse 1, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who has endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you become weary and discouraged in your souls. I'm just telling you, if you're thinking, an eternal reward sounds kind of good, but right now it's difficult. There is this great cloud of witnesses that are testifying that faith, even during sacrifice and suffering, is worth it because of the reward. Second, they looked to the reward, and we are looking to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who is the one that makes our reward certain. And also, I want you to note that Jesus did the same thing that they did and that we're called to do. He looked beyond the cross and the shame to the reward, and he was rewarded just as we will be. And finally, we need to consider him, he says, intentionally think about this. Keep it before us as we live our lives and as we especially make our choices, lest you become weary and discouraged in your souls. Thanks for studying with us, Andy. Thanks for being with us today.
Yep. Keep your eyes on the goal. Keep your eyes on Jesus.
Have a good night.